There are a few aspects of Ulmer's memorial that stand out. The first is the idea of mourning. The fundamental idea behind a memorial is to allow for mourning for those who view it to understand the loss and to feel the grief of that loss. Another concept that Ulmer discusses is that of a disaster, or the personal experience of a disaster. Ulmer also discusses that the memorial goes beyond what is physical. A memorial is formless and peripheral. It is quick and based on emotion and is experienced as a supplement to literate means of monumentality. A final important aspect of the memorial that Ulmer describes is that of the abject sacrifice, or the sacrifice that is not realized. In order to better understand the concept of memorial, it is beneficial to investigate and relate the idea to one's own personal experience of a disaster that not only applies to oneself, but also to some societal sacrifice that deserves mourning and recognition. For me, that personal disaster is the events of March 1st, 2007. It was on that day that a tornado touched down in my hometown of Enterprise, Alabama. This is one that I will never forget because it tore through my high school, killing 8 students. Looking back on that day, I realized that natural disasters happen all the time, all over the world, every year, but nothing compares to the personal experience of surviving a natural disaster. That day started out like any other, with me riding the bus to school with all of my friends, preparing for another day of monotony as a junior at Enterprise High School. As the day progressed, it seemed like an average day, lots of rain, but when you are locked up in a classroom, you don't really notice the weather or the world outside of school. However, as the day progressed, our attention turned and our lives changed. During the experience, I didn't feel scared. At first, I was really relieved that we were maybe going to get out of school early. I also thought it was fun that we were actually allowed to get out our cell phones, something that was normally completely taboo at school. As we all sat out in that hallway on that day, we weren't thinking about loss and disaster, but about our social lives and the excitement of a break from class. My personal experience of that tornado was different than any other person's. My mom came to pick me up from the school minutes before the tornado struck, and I could see it in the rearview mirror. I was traumatized by the fact that I was a survivor and that I was not physically in the building when the walls collapsed. However, if I had been, I would have died and would no longer be a living person, but a sacrifice to mourn. Every other person connected to the school and to those who died experienced a disaster differently. Someone like the teacher who lost her daughter that day would have had a different experience than the rescue workers who encountered bleeding students covered in rubble. Just as the student on Third Hall, where the walls collapsed, experienced it differently than those who were on the first hall that went into the rubble to pull out their fellow students. This distinct and individual experience leads me to my next point, which is that a memorial is about mourning, and about being able to grieve a loss in a personal or peripheral manner. Mourning, in the sense of a memorial, opens up a distinction between the private and the public. Through a memorial, I can grieve my personal loss and experience of disaster in a public way. When people think of mourning, they think of funerals, wearing black, and crying on one another's shoulders. And despite that these things happen, what really helps with grief is remembering. After the tornado, people banded together to memorialize the event through shirts, car stickers, armbands, etc. Just something small that would show grief without having to say a word. The peripheral way of mourning is something that can be quick and full of emotion, but does not require permanence or physical presence. When I think of peripheral, I think of images and pathos. For Ulmer, the peripheral is a transitional device. It relates the literate monumentality of the physical to its electric counterpart. When thinking about the tornado and that experience, the images that are listed are those of the torn apart school, broken trees, and trashed cars. But also I think of the images that people created. They created collages with the faces of those 8 students. They incorporated the Enterprise Wildcat Paw, and the most poignant image is that of the 8 doves flying upwards out of the rubble of the high school. This image was distributed all over the city and helped people to cope with the tragedy. All of the images that were created after the tornado and distributed via the internet and Facebook, etc., were all peripheral expressions of grief. People were trying to show their mourning in a memorialized way without waiting for a physical monument to be erected. In the case of Enterprise High School, there wasn't a physical memorial until years after the tornado. And just as Ulmer explains, the electric memorial is more immediate and personal than a physical monument. In all honesty, when I saw the physical memorial that they put up for those students, I didn't really feel very moved. There are 8 pillars with their faces in bronze in a semicircle around a memorial fountain. It didn't seem very emotional or personal for me. Instead, the physical memorial that I relate to is a giant blue wildcat paw that I stole from the damaged remains of the high school. We were allowed to go back in with a guide, and I saw the paw laying in a pile of trash in the cafeteria. It was going to be thrown out with the rest of the rubble, and instead I saved it and brought it home. It is now hanging on one of the walls of my bedroom. It is my own memorial to remember what happened and how I felt on that day. It also reminds me of what used to be, the normal monotony of eating lunch in the school cafeteria with hundreds of other high school students. It is a more personal monument, but still a physical one. For Ulmer, memorial should not only allow for mourning, but also for an acknowledgement of the abject sacrifice. The sacrifice is something that may not be addressed as a sacrifice in the terms that the public understands. The deaths of students from a natural disaster like a tornado do not seem to have value or justification. However, the deaths of these 8 students highlight the idea that there is death through natural disasters all over the country. While it may not seem like a sacrifice, there are going to be natural disasters that topple houses and tear down buildings. In order to live normal lives and to be able to go into these public buildings, we are accepting that some people will die because of the perviousness of these structures. In order to memorialize these sacrifices, I would call attention to other sacrifices for nature that are recognized. For example, in Enterprise, there's a monument in the middle of the road to the boll weevil, which is a bug that ate the entire cotton crop, but despite this tragedy, led the county to plant peanuts and become one of the most prosperous peanut producers in the nation. My idea for a memorial would be to incorporate the idea of the sacrifice of the school with another sacrifice that the town experienced in its history. The sacrifice of these 8 students would be reflected on the boll weevil monument by replacing the bug, the boll weevil, with the wildcat paw that is such an emblem of the sacrifice and the mourning for those 8 students.